History as it happens, June 4th, 2024. Saddam and his American friends.
The Iraqis claimed that the Iranians were refusing to implement border agreements, and the first skirmishes broke out.
Saddam was deeply unhappy over the agreement, and the recovery of this territory was one of the prime targets of the current fighting.
Even at moments like these, then, we must address directly the reason the USS Stark and her men were there in the Persian Gulf.
Mr. Chairman, the potential for improvement in conduct is certainly there. The Iraqis have been talking about a new constitution and expansion of participatory democracy.
Saddam Hussein is literally trying to wipe a country off the face of the earth.
The root cause of our problems with Iraq is Saddam Hussein himself.
The crisis in the Persian Gulf can be resolved in a nonviolent manner through the continuation of strong economic sanctions against Iraq.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Before U.S. leaders would compare Saddam Hussein to Hitler or warn about mushroom clouds, Iraq's dictator had friends in Washington. Not buddy-buddy, but close enough that even when Saddam gassed his enemies, American presidents were willing to let it go. This may seem impossible to believe, given the long war on Iraq that began in 1991 and still has not entirely ended. How did we get here from there? That's next with Steve Call as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but what they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they will welcome as liberators the United States.
There's all this discourse about how if only Al Gore had been elected president by those 537 votes, the Iraq war would never have happened. But when you look at the regime change and the debates within the Clinton administration, Al Gore was a hawk on this and fully committed to regime change. Would he have had some kind of similar reaction after 9/11 that we ought to take care of this unfinished business?
Ronald Reagan delivered many memorable speeches during his presidency, but the only folks who may remember what he said on May 22, 1987 in Jacksonville, Florida, are those who were there at a memorial service for the 37 men who died aboard the USS Stark 5 days earlier in the Persian Gulf, when an Iraqi warplane hit the Stark with a missile in a mistaken attack.
When young Americans, like those of the USS Stark, die in far-off seas, we learn again how right President Kennedy was when he spoke of the sacrifices asked by a hard and bitter peace and our own long twilight struggle. Even at moments like these, then, we must address directly the reason the USS Stark and her men were there in the Persian Gulf. You're entitled to know the importance of the role that their valor played in keeping our world safe for peace and freedom. There's a reason why, since 1949, American ships have patrolled the Gulf. Every American president since World War II has understood the strategic importance of this region. It is a region that is a crossroads for 3 continents and the starting place for the oil that is the lifeblood of much of the world economy, especially those of our allies in Europe. Even more important, this is a region critical to avoiding larger conflict in the tinderbox that is the Middle East. And our role there is essential to building the conditions for peace in that troubled, dangerous part of the world.
As Steve Call writes on page 108 of The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the origins of America's invasion of Iraq. When news of the Stark reached Washington, Reagan's military and diplomatic advisors assumed the strike had been an accident. On May 18th, as the American death toll rose toward 37, President Reagan made a statement that included no criticism of Iraq. Saddam hastily signed a letter to Reagan. "I would like to express to you my deepest regret for the painful incident," he wrote. Iraqi warplanes had no intention whatsoever to strike against a target belonging to your country or any country other than Iran. The incident was a tragic accident, said Saddam, who asked Reagan to kindly convey to the families of the victims my personal condolences and sympathy. This was the 1980s, the decade of the Iran-Iraq War.
He's claimed that the Iranians were refusing to implement border agreements, and the first skirmishes broke out. In the first big incursion, Iraqi tanks rolled into Zain al-Qaus on September the 7th.
When the Reagan White House authorized the CIA to share intelligence with Saddam's military so that it could avert defeat in its war against Iran, a war Saddam started in 1980.
The United Nations, the big powers, the Islamic states, all urged Iraq and Iran to come to the negotiating table.
As call continues, the attack was probably an accident, yet the eagerness of the Reagan administration to absolve Saddam reflected a certain desperation in Washington about restoring ties with Baghdad after Iran-Contra.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
Well, here's another speech, actually a hearing on Capitol Hill that no one today remembers. April 26, 1990, about 4 months before Iraq would invade Kuwait. John Kelly, Assistant Secretary of Defense, testifying before a House panel on U.S.-Iraq relations, testifying against a proposal to sanction Iraq for troubling behavior in the human rights and illicit weapons arenas.
Mr. Chairman, our policy towards Iraq has been to attempt to develop gradually a mutually beneficial relationship with Iraq in order to strengthen positive trends in Iraq's foreign and domestic policies.
The idea, as far as the Bush White House was concerned, was that U.S.-Iraq relations could still be useful, could still serve U.S. interests in the Middle East. In fact, days before Saddam sent his armies into Kuwait on August 2, 1990, President George H.W. Bush sent a letter to the dictator assuring him, "My administration continues to desire better relations." Well, soon the president would be comparing Saddam to Hitler, and the long U.S. war against Iraq would begin.
Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition.
A decisive victory, or so it seemed, in the first Gulf War did not end the conflict, as the Clinton administration maintained cruel sanctions on Iraq and bombed Baghdad after Saddam kicked out the inspectors years later.
A medium-term goal is, in fact, to have him comply with the Security Council resolutions, and I believe that he can't have two contradictory things, which is to have sanctions lifted and retain his weapons of mass destruction.
After that bombing in 1998, what South Carolina Republican Congressman Floyd Spence said on the floor of the House one day might have been said by any number of Democrats or Republicans or national security officials, as the U.S. would soon formally adopt the policy of regime change.
The root cause of our problems with Iraq is Saddam Hussein himself. The time is long overdue to implement a broader and more aggressive strategy that has at its ultimate goal the replacement of Saddam Hussein's dictatorial regime.
Again, that was in 98. The George W. Bush administration invaded Iraq in 2003 after 9/11 created a new atmosphere of fear and insecurity.
Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
Last year, I dedicated 4 episodes in a series about the origins of the 2003 invasion and its ongoing consequences for a United States whose prestige and influence remain greatly diminished, and for the people of Iraq whose country was destroyed first by sanctions, then by 2 decades of war. I'll include links to those earlier episodes in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. Newsletter comes out every Friday. Today, we're going to widen our lens a bit and wind the clock back to the decades before 9/11, as Steve Call does in his excellent book, The Achilles Trap. This will help us answer the question as to why the United States got tied up with a tin-pot dictator to begin with, and why each side continued to misread the other. As I said in my review of Call's book, this is a story of mutual misperceptions and miscalculations, rarely tempered by sufficient self-reflection. But we must return to this subject, as painful as it is. U.S. foreign policy hasn't magically fixed itself. It is still possible to repeat these mistakes. As long as our leaders, Democrats or Republicans, are convinced they're obligated to shape the world while cynically embracing dictators and despots when considered necessary. So that is why we're going to talk about structures and patterns rather than just partisan analysis. Steve Call is one of the great investigative journalists in the world today. His Ghost Wars, published in 2004, won the Pulitzer Prize. The follow-up volume, Directorate S, published in 2018, is also a must-read. He is Dean Emeritus of the Columbia Journalism School and once led the New America Foundation here in Washington. Today, he joins us from London. Hello, Steve Call.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I do mean welcome. I've admired your work for quite a while. And you probably remember we met briefly at the Cato Institute. This was way before the pandemic. You were there to talk about Directorate S. So I guess I can't say I'm meeting you today.
Yes, well, you were very diligent at that event, as I remember it.
Well, I made sure to read your entire book in the week preceding the event, and I did something similar with The Achilles Trap. I read it in a few days, a few sittings, and then wrote my generally positive review in the Washington Times. But now I'm going to grill you mercilessly. As you know, the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion last year did bring on a lot of retrospectives. Several books were written about it from an Iraqi or U.S. point of view. What inspired you to look at Iraq?
Well, it started years ago, before the pandemic. I found myself thinking about a question that I'd first encountered as a reporter at the Washington Post, covering the Gulf War in 1990, and then again in Baghdad after 2003, when the WMD that had been, sort of the premise of the war, by October of 2003, it was pretty clear that it wasn't there. And the Iraq Survey Group, which was the CIA kind of affiliated investigative task force that had been sent initially to find the weapons, I kind of met them in Baghdad that October, and they were starting to come to terms with the fact that their mission was going to be to explain why there weren't any weapons. As I talked to them, these were inspectors, weapons specialists who had been working on Iraq for a long time. They kept asking this question, literally casting their eyes to the sky, like, Saddam, what were you thinking? Then they had speculative hypotheses about why Saddam had contributed to this misimpression that he had weapons when he didn't. He had ultimately surrendered his regime. Eventually, he surrendered his life for the sake of this bluff, as some people called it. And so I, for many years, wondered what that was really about. And then I discovered the question might be answerable because Saddam tape recorded his leadership conversations more assiduously than Richard Nixon. And when I was able to get a hold of those tapes, that's where this book was born.
Yeah, those tapes are remarkable. I did not listen to them. I just read the transcripts of some of them as they appeared in your book. And the new, well, they're not new, but newly acquired or obtained Iraqi government documents that also support your book. And I think that's what makes the Achilles Trap so valuable, this new information and source material. And, we have to continue to reassess and reevaluate what happened, not just in 2003, but for decades prior to that, as a country, as a people, because it has implications for our current foreign policy as we continue to, grasp at our hegemony and the idea that we have to shape the global environment. I know that's a lot. We'll get to all of these themes during our conversation, but I was pleased that you didn't just rehash the history of the intelligence failings in the months preceding March 19th, 2003. You wound back the clock to the days of the Ba'athist Revolution, and then you charted Saddam's rule over 4 U.S. administrations. And I really appreciate that kind of structural analysis of U.S. foreign policy, which I think is missing from a lot of books, a lot of history books. Do you agree with me on that? And why did you roll back the clock decades?
Well, you sort of answered the question. I mean, I wanted to enlarge our understanding of the origins of the Iraq invasion by including Saddam's part in it, using these new materials, but also by lengthening the time frame by which we understood how this evolved. So I originally thought that I would start at the end of the Gulf War that followed Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And I was talking to a longtime American civil servant who had been on the Iraq Survey Group and had dug into all these materials as much as any American. And I was saying, look, I think I'll start in 1990. That's earlier than most people would. And he said, oh, no, that's too recent. You have to go back to the 80s to really understand. And I walked away thinking, I wonder if that's really true. But the more I read, the more I did understand that the entanglements that led to 2003 really begin with our effort to build an alliance with Saddam Hussein during the 1980s, when we sought to prevent him from losing the war with Iran that he had started by providing him secret advantages, satellite imagery that CIA officers shared with him. And when you look at the tapes and the records of how his thinking about America evolved, how his thinking about WMD evolved, it really does start in that period in the 1980s.
Yeah, there's no question that Saddam at one point had a nuclear weapons program, not just a nuclear power program. But you talked a little bit about your professional motivation as a journalist who's been writing about intelligence matters for a long time, and why you approached this subject and wrote a book about it. Do you have any other central hopes that motivate your research or your books?
I'm not sure that I see myself as on this mission, but for whatever set of reasons, maybe it's just what I know how to do or the only thing I know how to do. My method often is to work backwards from costly failures of American foreign policy decision-making and to try to unpack how that happened. I tend to write about intelligence history, but also to weave in diplomatic and military history to try to see the origins of American foreign policy crises, not just from the perspective of the White House, but also from the perspective of our adversaries. That's probably the best way to understand how these mistakes evolve in world history and then perhaps how to avoid them. The book that influenced me most probably was Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, which is about the origins of World War I. But it's written from the Russian perspective, the French perspective, the British perspective, the German perspective, and it cuts back and forth. And by the time you get to the summer of 1914, you are in despairing realization that this was a train slowly rolling toward the cliff for a long time. And I think 2003, in the end, feels a little bit like that, too.
Well, I never saw you as a crusader, but you know that some journalists and historians are. They delve into the past to expose the mistakes because they want to get it right the next time. They want their country to go about interventionism or whatever, foreign adventures, right the next time, not repeat the same mistakes when trying to shape the global environment. So let's talk about the Saddam audio tapes. They have a history unto themselves. Some people weren't very happy that people like you wanted to obtain them and use them to support your research.
They have a strange history, but the short version is that excerpts of them were released through a research center at National Defense University in the mid-2000s in the late Bush administration. And they were available into the first Obama term to journalists and scholars. And some scholars made very good use of the Saddam tapes to dig into particulars about the Ba'ath Party and the nature of Saddam's dictatorship. But there'd never really been broad access, and the materials that were released were not complete. And then in 2015, they were withdrawn entirely. Kind of mysterious as to why, but by the time I came looking for them, they were sitting on a hard drive in the Pentagon. And with support from an NGO called Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which is a bunch of lawyers who sue over FOIA matters and other things to enlarge press freedoms, I filed a FOIA lawsuit against the Pentagon to obtain these materials or a batch of these materials. I submitted a targeted lawsuit based on materials that I knew they had and that they could easily find to try to make it easier to win. And that worked. And I got the materials that way.
So, one observation I came away with after reading the transcripts or the pieces of the audio tapes that you include in your book is that Saddam Hussein, like many dictators, wants to create the impression of running a tight and disciplined ship. But there were times where, he's even unaware, asking his generals, what weapons do we have left? Where are the records? Does anyone know what's actually going on here? Can you talk about that dynamic, that there were times where Saddam could be really in control and he was quite scary. People who were speaking to him in these meetings didn't know if they were going to say something that would get them in a lot of trouble. But there were also times where he was aloof, especially later in his life.
On the first element of that, which is his uncertainty about whether his orders were being followed. I mean, it's sort of ironic because he was a micromanager. When he was doling out corrupt oil contracts to his own cronies, he kept the ledger and hand wrote every approval, sort of like dictators signing every check. He was a hard worker and very attentive to his big administrative state. But, you know, he lived in a world where he knew that he couldn't trust what everybody said to him because he was a scary figure and people were always telling him what he wanted to hear. And occasionally his close relatives would say, you know what, I'm going to tell you what none of these generals will tell you, which is that actually things are not perfect, boss. And only his son-in-law could get away with that, at least if he did it in moderation. There were times on critical matters, you named two, had his orders to destroy WMD, which he had in fact issued by the time we get to 2002, 2003, had those orders been followed, he was worried that people might not be trying to defy him, but that they just might not have been competent. They might not have carried out things to a T. And on the other side, his own generals who were responsible for the defense of Iraq, they were confused about whether he had something up his sleeve. Even though he had issued these orders in meetings that weapons should be destroyed, he would also say things like, don't worry, I got this. The Americans don't scare me. And so they thought, well, there's probably something hidden. So if you live in a world of conspiracies and paranoia and terror, you don't get clean communication. And that's kind of what shows up on these tapes.
Well, he could be shrewd and calculating in a smart way, but as you say, he also was gripped by paranoia, assassination plots. He was also concerned about Zionism, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that really clouded his understanding of how decisions were being made in the United States, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that was one of the things that was striking about living with him through these transcripts and tapes and letters and memos. He could, in one paragraph, be strikingly shrewd about how power works. I suppose over time I came to think, well, that's not surprising. He retained power in very difficult circumstances for a long time, and he warded off a great number of both internal and external enemies. So he had to be shrewd, and he was. He could be incredibly prescient about how shifts in global geopolitics would affect Iraq, would affect his neighborhood. But then in the very next paragraph, he could go off half-cocked about the global Zionist conspiracy and the blood libels of late 19th century and early 20th century anti-Semitic blood libels. He genuinely believed that the United States, Israel, and the Ayatollahs of revolutionary Iran were aligned against him and were cooperating in global affairs at Iraq's expense. Now, was he entirely mad to believe this? The Iran-Contra conspiracy, revealed in 1986, persuaded him of the opposite. He had suspected this amid many assurances from American diplomats and even his own advisors that he was maybe overreaching to see such a dark collaboration between the U.S., Israel, and revolutionary Iran. After all, Iran and the United States were in open conflict in so many theaters. How could this be? And then it was revealed that the Reagan administration, in a sort of well-intentioned but harebrained effort to obtain the release of American and other Western hostages held by Iranian proxies in Lebanon, had in fact collaborated with Israel to sell weapons to revolutionary Iran that they were using against Iraq. And many people in the world were shocked in November 1986 when that was revealed. The one world leader who saw it coming was Saddam Hussein, and we have the transcript of his meeting after Reagan made a speech about this. His schadenfreude is all over the page. I told you so. People doubted me. And it mattered because it confirmed this view, and he held on to it right through the 90s and up until 2003.
It did shock a lot of people, apparently including Ronald Reagan himself. Now, Reagan knew what was happening, but he couldn't convince himself that he actually was trading weapons for hostages.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence
tell me it is not.
Maybe we'll return to Reagan in a bit. Saddam was also writing books, novels, when he should have been doing other things like, I don't know, preparing his country for an invasion. Talk a little bit about this hobby of his.
It came to him in his sort of early 60s, and it really wasn't well understood by our government or anyone outside of his inner circle, his poor editors who were getting all these handwritten pages that he was producing day after day. He wrote 4 novels in pretty rapid succession from the last year of the 1990s right through until the spring of 2003 or the late winter of 2003, when he was putting the finishing touches on his 4th novel as American tanks rolled across the border into Iraq. And we had no idea how obsessed he'd become with literary achievement after 9/11, leading to the invasion, in part because we'd had no contact with him or his senior advisors since 1990, the fall of 1990, early 1991. And this was to try to isolate him, to enforce sanctions against him. But it proved to be a kind of self-defeating strategy to never talk to your enemy. If you believe your enemy can hurt you, it just seems to me irrational. In this case, I think helps to demonstrate the potential costs. Yes, there are prices to pay in domestic politics and possibly in coalition maintenance if you're seen to be accommodating an adversary by talking. But you can use back channels. That's what secret spies are for. You can have lots of other forms of contact. And it's not because you think you're going to necessarily solve anything or bring someone like Saddam Hussein around to his senses, but it's the contact, as every journalist knows, it's the contact that reveals something you didn't know before, often inadvertently, or it accumulates through 5 or 6 conversations. Suddenly you get something that you didn't understand before, and we deprived ourselves of that basic statecraft.
Well, the decision to treat Saddam like Hitler is all the more astonishing in retrospect, considering that in 1987, the USS Stark. Explain what happened there. I don't think a lot of people remember this.
Yeah, the USS Stark was a missile ship patrolling the Persian Gulf to keep shipping free and to support neutral Kuwaiti tankers that were getting caught in the crossfire of the Iran-Iraq war. And by 1987, because the U.S. was secretly cooperating with Saddam and providing him with exclusive intelligence, notwithstanding the Iran-Contra double dealing, they were back to trying to persuade him, yeah, we're on your side. We really don't want you to lose this war. That was an aberration. Iran-Contra was an aberration. And he didn't believe it, but he was willing to accept authentic intelligence. And so a lot of work had been done to try to deconflict American patrols in the Gulf from Iraqi aircraft fighting against Iran. The reason was that the Americans basically didn't want to get in Saddam's way as he was prosecuting his war against Iran. So information was exchanged. There were protocols about transponders. And the USS Stark was on a routine patrol when an Iraqi warplane surfaced on its radar. It was immediately recognized as nothing to worry about because it was an Iraqi plane and we were allies after all. Instead, the plane approached and let loose air-to-ship missiles that tore massive holes and killed a number of sailors and left the Stark dead in the water. It was an enormous event and really shook the Reagan administration.
Yeah.
But we chose to decide that it was an accident. I think there were people involved in the investigation who weren't so sure what exactly had happened. My best take is that it probably was an accident, but that Saddam celebrated it internally, a sign that he could punish the Americans if he chose to do so.
Well, Ronald Reagan did not publicly criticize Saddam Hussein after this happened.
Even at moments like these, then we must address directly the reason the USS Stark and her men were there in the Persian Gulf. You're entitled to know the importance of the role that their valor played in keeping our world safe for peace and freedom. There's a reason why, since 1949, American ships have patrolled the Gulf. Every American president since World War II has understood the strategic importance of this region. It is a region that is a crossroads for 3 continents and the starting place for the oil that is the lifeblood of much of the world economy, especially those of our allies in Europe. Even more important, this is a region critical to avoiding larger conflict in the tinderbox that is the Middle East.
even though about 40 Americans were killed, and Saddam apologized. He actually wrote a letter to Reagan, heartfelt apology, if something like that is even possible from a man like Saddam Hussein, but he did apologize.
Both sides feared, for good reason, that the deaths of so many American sailors in a clear act of war would mean the end of the cooperation between the Reagan administration and Saddam. The secret extent and the value of that cooperation was not known to the American public. The reason it was judged to be so important was that Iran continued to threaten a breakthrough in the war with Iraq, and the fear was that Iran's forces would drive straight through to Baghdad. Ayatollah Khomeini had promised to overthrow Saddam hanging from the nearest lamppost and replace him with a revolutionary Shia regime that would only extend the already difficult problem of Iran's regional ambitions. So the Americans really did not want Saddam to lose that war, and they were willing to swallow an event like the Stark if they could get away with it in domestic politics. And so they told Saddam, the only way we're going to hang on to this relationship is if you apologize like you've never apologized before. And he got it, and he wrote that letter.
Even worse, the following year, the gassing of the Kurds. The Reagan administration looked the other way there as well. I mean, publicly they've said some things, but it didn't end the relationship. And as you try in your book to chart this path to 2003, how did the United States get involved with a country that, in my view, is not worthy of our attention, this tin pot dictator, Saddam Hussein? Well, there was a Cold War context. There was also Middle East politics, that context as well, working in the 1980s. But this is really the start of it. The Reagan administration shook hands, literally, sending Donald Rumsfeld as the emissary to meet Saddam because it was deemed very important to not have Iran win in the 1980s. But then after the Cold War ends, well, now this guy wants to invade Kuwait. Maybe we're not going to tolerate this. I guess there's not really a question there, Steve, but I think you get the point I'm making.
Yeah, I mean, Saddam was the case that sort of stretched the fabric of what had been, since the oil shocks of the 1970s, American priorities in that part of the Middle East. And those priorities were to protect the oil-producing small, vulnerable Gulf kingdoms, Saudi Arabia most of all, but also Kuwait and UAE and Bahrain. Those were our local allies. They didn't have armies. They didn't have air forces. They relied on us. It was oil for security. That was the deal. And Saddam became our thug and the Gulf kingdom's thug, who was willing to fight a war with Iran and to contain the threat of the Iranian Revolution, which these small kingdoms all feared. The structure of the problem that you describe was our alliance with these oil-producing kingdoms. That's why we bothered with Saddam.
And as you say in your book, because U.S. leaders, quote, pulled their punches when Saddam gassed his enemies, he figured he might get away with invading Kuwait later. We're going to return to that hinge point I mentioned, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, in a moment. I just want to backtrack a little to the nuclear program. Your chapters about Saddam Hussein and Iraq's nuclear weapons program are really remarkable. There was some internal dissension. Some of these scientists, Iraqi scientists, didn't want to do a nuclear bomb. They thought it would be a disaster to go that route. Others kind of went along with it, or they did go along with it, but they were never sure they'd actually be able to accomplish it. What were the obstacles to actually making Iraq a nuclear power? And two, how close did they ever really get to that?
The obstacles were that it's just hard to build a nuclear bomb from scratch, especially if you don't have international assistance. And Saddam's orders to his very talented physicists, particularly the leader of the program, a guy named Dia Jafar, who was educated in the UK, it's kind of the Robert Oppenheimer of the program.
Now, you interviewed him quite a bit, apparently, for the book. So.
Yeah, I did. He's a kind of a remarkable figure. But in any event, Saddam ordered him not to get caught smuggling in prohibited materials while he built this weapon. He didn't put time pressure on him. He said it's more important not to get caught than to go fast. And so Jafar tried to build a weapon using only indigenous talent and resources and importing the absolute minimum of potentially triggering materials. So it took a while, but he got there in that he was manufacturing small amounts of fissionable uranium and had the infrastructure to do more. Those were the obstacles imposed by Saddam. How close did they get? The world had no idea that this was going on. A massive infrastructure had been built up. There were actually 2 uranium enrichment programs going at full force by the end of it. Then Saddam invaded Kuwait, and he shortened the timeline of discovery unintentionally because after he lost the war, inspectors came in and they saw what was there. It shocked the United States, the George H.W. Bush administration in the summer of 1991, just when they thought they were done with Saddam, had to deal with the fact that they discovered that he was reasonably close to a nuclear bomb. How close? The international experts at the Atomic Energy Commission that inspected Iraq's program, they said, well, maybe 6 to 12 months for one crude finished bomb. The scientists who worked on the program, who I talked to, said, oh, that's way too aggressive. We were 2, 3, maybe 4 years away. So somewhere in that range. I think from the world's perspective, it didn't really matter. Any path to a bomb that Saddam could wield, even if he had to drop it out of an airplane crudely flying over Tel Aviv or Riyadh, would have been, nightmarish.
Yeah, the U.S. knew, and other countries knew, of course, about the biological and chemical weapons. The regime had used chemical weapons against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. But the nuclear program, as you say, came as a huge shock to the world. And it's like, okay, what else then are we missing about this guy? You also say here, in the cascade of errors that led to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Bush administration's failure to deter Saddam Hussein from invading Kuwait in 1990, so this is the first Bush administration, as well as Saddam's failure to grasp what would have happened after he acted, stand out. I mean, yours is a story of miscalculations, misperceptions. So we have here the summer, fall 1990. Bush administration's not quite sure what Saddam Hussein is doing, about to invade Kuwait. Arab countries are saying he's just bluffing. And President George H.W. Bush is sending these meekly worded letters to Saddam, reassuring him, we want better relations with you. What was going on there? I mean, why did they still want good relations with him?
Because government policies, especially these kinds of policies, run on a kind of automatic pilot. There was an oral history with some American diplomats chewing on the very question you asked. And one of them said, what's the hardest thing to do in American government? Change a failed policy. Everyone says, well, if we just tweak it 3 months from now, 6 months from now, or if we add these elements to it, it'll start to work. That's part of what happened. They inherited this sort of alliance with Saddam, devil's bargain with Saddam from the Reagan administration in the George H.W. Bush administration. Of course, George H.W. Bush had been vice president during the crafting of this alliance. And they did a review, as new administrations are wont to do. And Bush concluded, look, it's not perfect. We would love it if he didn't use chemical weapons, but there's a lot of trade to be done here. It's good for American business. It assures our Gulf oil-producing allies that we got their back, and it annoys Iran. So let's carry on. That was the state of affairs in the spring of 1990 when they started getting indications that Saddam was going seriously to consider invading, occupying, and looting Kuwait, his small oil-rich neighbor. Bush, as you mentioned, he did what you'd expect an experienced foreign policy president to do. He started calling all of his allies. What should I make of this? I'm worried. He called King Fahd. He called Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. He called King Hussein in Jordan, who probably knew Saddam the best. And they all told him, don't worry, George. We got this. This is all a bluff. He's just making noise. He wants the Kuwaitis to pay him and to help him with the reparations that he needs to deal with to rebuild Iraq after the Iran war. And so you shouldn't do anything to deter him or to even call attention to this. Bush took the advice, and of course it led to disaster.
He was an SOB, but he was our SOB. And as a hegemonic power wanting to control or shape the global environment, you're right, we just can't drop the guy, but now he's our problem. One more question, though, about the deterrence issue. April Glaspie. She was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, and she's taken a lot of blame over the years for apparently or allegedly giving Saddam a green light. What did she say to him that some people afterward mistook as her telling Saddam, if you go ahead and invade Kuwait, the United States won't care?
Right. Well, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, there was a huge fallout in political Washington. Who let this happen? Who lost Kuwait? April Glaspie, who was the ambassador in Baghdad, was thrown under the bus by the Bush administration and many other people in political Washington who didn't want to be blamed themselves for having been soft on Saddam, as they often had been for many years prior to the invasion. Now, she was a target because she was the last senior American official to meet with Saddam. He summoned her hastily to a meeting in July of 1990, several weeks before he invaded Kuwait. There were transcripts, hers and the Iraqis, that basically described the same discussion with some minor differences. The essence of it was that she read out talking points that had been provided to her by Secretary of State James Baker and the White House, and she stuck to those talking points. But at the time, it was possible to say that she had been really the author of these too soft messages to Saddam. So I really dug into this and tried to go back over it with a fine-tooth comb. And what I concluded was that she had been very unfairly blamed for this, because if her messages were too accommodating, they were written word for her by the Bush White House and State Department. She was a professional diplomat. You don't go into a meeting with a dictator and start making up American foreign policy or using improvisational language. If you don't have written instructions, you just say, I'll get back to you. She did have written instructions, and she recited them word for word. And so if you're going to blame somebody for the messaging Saddam received, it should be the president and his aides.
And obviously Saddam miscalculated badly, too.
Yes, and he wasn't really listening for the signals of what the Americans would do. He was worried a little bit about whether the United States might come to the defense of Kuwait, but he didn't really probe that in his own interest very well.
Because he didn't sense the change in the global environment. I mean, something did happen. The Cold War pretty much came to an end, and the Soviet Union wasn't going to back up Iraq anymore, even though, of course, it was the U.S. helping Saddam during the 1980s. But yeah, he kind of missed that, didn't he?
He missed what it would mean for him after he invaded Kuwait, although he was quite shrewd about what the end of the Cold War would mean for him and for his region, because he gave a speech not long after the Berlin Wall fell, in which he said, basically, a period of American hegemony is coming. The Soviet Union is finished as a world power. Forget about them. We're going to be in a unipolar world, and it's not going to be good for Iraq or for our neighborhood. He said eventually another power is going to rise to challenge the United States, but it might take 20 years. So in the meantime, we're going to have to fight back. Now, you read that. I mean, that was like maybe January 1990, somewhere around there. And I read that. I was like, that was not on the cover of Time magazine at the time. I mean, that was quite prescient. But then when he came to invading Kuwait, he didn't expect that the U.S. and Gorbachev would cooperate and assemble this massive coalition against him, or that the independence of an autocratic kingdom that happened to have a lot of oil would become a principle of some new world order as pronounced by the United States.
Yeah, New World Order.
Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era.
If this dictator thinks he can get away with invading some little country, well, that gives license to any aggressive state anywhere to do the same, when we need to have a rules-based order that is consistent so we can finally have peace. This never really happened, but George H.W. Bush, I believe, was being earnest when he said these things. In those speeches he gave to Congress, he was very much in the limelight there.
No peaceful international order is possible if larger states can devour their smaller neighbors.
You know, he talked about ending the rule of the jungle in that speech in 1990 and moving toward this new rules-based order that he wished could have taken place or been established after 1945, but the Cold War got in the way. This never happened after the Cold War, but do you believe Bush really believed in this?
Yeah, I do. And I think he was also pragmatic. I'm sure he was stunned by where Gorbachev was going as the Cold War unwound, as Europe changed. And lashing Gorbachev to a vision like that, while at the same time shepherding political transitions all across Central and Eastern Europe, and even facilitating the reunification of Germany. I mean, those were enormous achievements, and he shaped them in American interests as, at least as they had been defined since the end of the Second World War, in that they strengthened the alliance, the transatlantic alliance, at the expense of an aggressive Moscow-based adversary. So, he did both kind of realpolitik and cast a vision on top of that was appealing to all the people who were involved in that business.
Yeah, James Baker said he knew the Cold War was over when he was meeting with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev gave the okay. The Soviet Union would not stand in the way at the UN Security Council of Operation Desert Storm. So we've been talking for about 30 minutes here. We're barely making it into the 1990s. I will have to condense in the interest of time, but everyone should read your book because there's no way we would be able to get to everything in there anyway in one conversation. But are you familiar with the work of historian Jeffrey Engel at Southern Methodist University? He has a book called When the World Seemed New. He found documents that indicate the initial response within the Bush administration after Saddam invaded Kuwait August 2nd, 1990 was, well, I mean, this is not everyone, but some of them. So what? What does it matter if a barrel of oil has an Iraqi or Kuwaiti flag on it?
Yeah, no, I am familiar with his work. He edited a really good volume about the Gulf crisis. There are now multiple accounts of the first National Security Council meeting that followed the invasion. Basically, everyone said, A, we don't have a defense treaty with Kuwait. We're not obliged to defend them. Our interest is in stopping Saddam from taking over Saudi Arabia. That's a red line. But there was a sense of acceptance that he might control Kuwait, which would substantially increase his oil power and his ability to use that revenue to buy weapons or to rebuild his army. But there was an acceptance of it and a sense that it wasn't possible to reverse it. And it took 5 or 6 days, including a meeting between Margaret Thatcher and George H.W. Bush in Aspen, where she tried to persuade him that he really needed to make a stand here, even if Kuwait was unpopular and even if the war looked like it might be costly, because there was a sense that many casualties would be required to reverse the Iraqi occupation.
Yeah, Saddam was both Hitler, but also weak. A hollowed-out military that was routed in, a matter of hours, not even days in that first Gulf War. Yeah, these other considerations we were discussing prevailed, New World Order, etc. Who won the first Gulf War? After reading your book, my answer is no one.
It's fair. I mean, it was celebrated as an enormous victory at arms for the American military, and certainly Colin Powell, who was there then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the commander in the theater, they achieved the objectives they laid out to the president in their war plan, but the objectives left the United States with a lot of unfinished business and a very costly stalemate because it left Saddam in power. George H.W. Bush, you can read his diaries. He's uneasy even as the surface victory is unfolding. He says, this guy is going to get away with claiming victory, even though we've defeated him. Where does that leave us? Well, he was right to be unsettled because it left the United States in a costly and, fixed conflict with Saddam that wasn't ultimately resolved until the invasion in 2003. When the invasion seemed like the best of a lot of bad choices, that tells you that 1991 wasn't much of a victory.
I agree. And during the 1990s, the sanctions regime on Iraq was catastrophic and is a stain, I think, on our nation's history. You spent a lot of time in the Clinton years in Ghost Wars, your Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the anti-Soviet jihad. Clinton his administration was probing for answers on how to deal with this emerging problem of radical Islamism. Same thing here, similar thing here. Clinton never quite sure how to handle Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, he really didn't want to deal with Iraq. He saw that as George H.W. Bush's war, his issue, and he was bent on trying to focus on domestic policy and manage foreign policy secondarily when in the first term. And then Saddam wouldn't let him alone, kept threatening to go back into Kuwait or refuse to cooperate with international inspectors. Eventually, the U.S. imposed a no-fly zone, both in the north and the south, and he would shoot at American airplanes. And so Clinton couldn't get this off his desk. And you can see in his conversations with other leaders that are now available, how frustrated he is. And you're right, he can't figure out a way out of the box. But all the alternatives to accepting this chronic sort of mini war seem worse than what he has. And in the end, he handed over a policy on paper of regime change, because by his second term, he decided that he would just declare that Saddam was a menace and that he would never get sanctions relief until he was removed. Iraq would never get sanctions relief until Saddam was removed from power. And so I was struck as I went back over the research how fully committed the Clinton administration was to regime change, even though it was more of a declaratory policy than an operational one. And, it makes you think, I don't know what you think, but I'd be interested. There's all this discourse about how if only Al Gore had been elected president by those 537 votes, the Iraq war would never have happened. But when you look at the regime change and the debates within the Clinton administration, Al Gore was a hawk on this and fully committed to regime change. Would he have had some kind of similar reaction after 9/11 that we ought to take care of this unfinished business? I'm sure he would say no, but I'm not so convinced.
That's an impossible question to answer, but I do tend to think that something probably would have eventually come around to Saddam Hussein because of this history we're discussing here. During the 90s, just a couple more things, Steve Call. During the 90s, Saddam himself said, well, I'm never going to get relief from sanctions. We can't trust the West. We don't have weapons. He was right about that. We don't have weapons. No matter what we do, we can't seem to convince them we don't have weapons. But, I don't want to let Saddam Hussein entirely off the hook here. He caused problems for himself during the 1990s, didn't he?
Yeah, he was the source of the original confusion. He is the source of the original sin in his disarmament. That's the thing that was impossible for people to get their minds around at the time. But what he did was, after the Kuwait War, which he lost in a conventional sense, he was ordered to give up all of his chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, the infrastructure that supported them, and to come clean about their history, and also to destroy missiles that had a certain range. He was defiant as the inspectors came in. But in private, he ordered his son-in-law to actually get rid of everything. They kept no records, they took no photographs, but they basically drove convoys out into the desert in the night and dumped all of their chemical stocks away. That was the original source of confusion. Why did he disarm but lie about it, not tell secret, even his own generals about it? And it puzzled me for the longest time, but gradually I came to think, and I think the records support this, that he wanted to have it both ways. First of all, he didn't want to be humiliated by being publicly disarmed by men in white coats, Swedish inspectors, humiliating him before the Arab world and encouraging his enemies, both domestic and in the neighborhood, to potentially attack him because now he looks so weak and beaten down. So first, there was pride. Second, as a practical matter, what he was really looking for was to get out of sanctions. And the French and the post-Gorbachev Russians were signaling to him, look, we'd love to do business with you. We can help you at the Security Council, but you got to give us something to work with. You got to pass inspections. You got to cooperate with the inspectors. He wanted the inspectors to arrive and not find anything, but he didn't want to publicly destroy it because that would be humiliating. So he told his son-in-law, get rid of everything. He hoped the inspectors would turn up, not find anything, and then he would get sanctions relief. That was his calculation. What followed was a lot of confusion for years and years. And it took him another 5 years before he really came clean with inspectors about what he was doing. And by the time we got to 2003, as we talked about earlier, even his own generals weren't sure what they had and what they didn't have.
Yeah, there's a conversation you relate in the book. He asks his generals, what do we've got left? I'm paraphrasing here. What do we got left? And they say to him, we don't know. We thought you knew.
Yeah, exactly.
Why asking us? And of course, they were always worried that he might be testing them, not really asking us.
Exactly. There's this one conversation where this very high-ranking comrade says, do we have WMD? And Saddam says, don't you know? And then he says, no. And Saddam says, no, we don't have WMD. And the guy walks away like his head's spinning. And he's like, was that just a test to see if maybe I was hiding something from him? So
Saddam took the definition of tough boss to a whole new and murderous level. So Melvin Leffler, the eminent historian that he is, I do think gave the Bush administration too much benefit of the doubt in his otherwise excellent book about the road to war that he published last year, Confronting Saddam Hussein. Loeffler spends a lot of time trying to determine when the decision to invade was made, because, he argues, this was not made rashly and it wasn't made right after 9/11. But, after thinking about this and then reading your book, I think it's better to consider the decision to invade as a series of decisions based on questionable notions of U.S. primacy and insecurity, which is a contradiction. If we're powerful and have primacy, why do we feel so insecure? Well, 9/11 happened. There may have been a day where Bush said, okay, with his generals, it's time to go. But they had created the conditions for that through coercive diplomacy, which was a trap. It made war the more likely outcome because you're forcing Saddam to give up something that he doesn't have and he can't prove that he doesn't have it. Meantime, you're mobilizing the army and preparing the army and air force to invade Iraq. You're not, in whatever date it was that Loeffler identified, going to decide, you know what, we're not going to do this after all. Where do you fall in this debate about when a decision was made?
I like your framing. I mean, I think a series of decisions is probably the better way to put it. I mean, I don't know how Loeffler describes or analyzes the instant turn to the subject of Iraq that the president and some of his aides made right after 9/11 and then returned to during the Afghan war in the fall and then turned to again with planning hats on in December of 2001. But to me, that is a level of intention that if it's not a decision, then we can talk about definitions, but it's certainly a source of momentum that, in my reading of such things in White Houses, doesn't usually just trail off. And I agree also about coercive diplomacy. I mean, going back over that, it was hard for me coming to this after so many other historians and journalists had done so, to figure out a way to freshen the narrative of the Bush administration's decision-making after 9/11. One area where I found material that was new, I think, generally to the record, was the Chilcot Report, which the Brits did, was a massive investigation of their own government's decision-making. And it provides a lot of snapshots that we haven't seen before, where British officials with access to Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, others, go into meetings and hear exactly what's happening and what the discourse is in the White House. And what's striking is the Bush administration never believed that coercive diplomacy was going to save them from fighting a war. They were trying to protect Tony Blair's government with it. They had buyer's remorse almost as soon as they did it. And Blair was the one who still thought maybe coercive diplomacy would work if somebody found a smoking gun, an intelligence operation or an inspector found a smoking gun that showed Saddam had been lying and that he really did have WMD. Maybe then Saddam would be coerced into essentially a preemptive surrender and an invasion wouldn't be necessary. Now, that was a quixotic hope as well, but that was Blair's outlook. The Bush administration, the record to me shows, was just marching through the process so they could get to the start of the invasion. And yes, you're right, there was a specific moment in January of 2003 where, for military purposes, Bush had to say, we're doing this, please get ready to do it. And then he called Colin Powell in famously and said, Colin, I need your support. And that's where the UN Adlai Stevenson speech was born. But that decision point was just a kind of mark along a much bigger chain of decisions and inclinations.
I agree 100%. You said it better than I did, by the way. Yeah, the British, I think it was Blair who asked Bush or told Bush, you need to take yes for an answer, meaning if we find out that there are no weapons of mass destruction and no one was finding any during these inspections, then, we can't have war. But then they went to Colin Powell for a reason. He was a credible figure. He was not seen as a hawk.
What I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community.
Did they lie? The word lie doesn't appear in your book.
I don't know. I mean, I find it hard to get inside Bush's head on these things. And the three people who made the most outrageous statements in public were the president, the vice president, and you could say Condoleezza Rice with her smoking gun, a mushroom cloud spin on national television at a critical moment.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production.
They had intelligence that told them that it was possible, probable, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, that Saddam had reconstituted his nuclear program, but they didn't have any basis in intelligence to use the kind of rhetoric that they did. Now, did they believe that this threat was real? Yes, but they engaged in the kind of spin propaganda, bordering on propaganda, that as responsible stewards of their offices and of the national interest crosses a line for me. Now, it doesn't quite feel like lying to me because I don't believe that they were consciously standing in front of somebody and telling them the opposite of what they knew to be true. But it was so irresponsible and reckless as to constitute a kind of, there are certain kinds of crimes where if you get reckless enough, your intentions don't matter. You've crossed the line.
The lying debate misses a more important point. I made it earlier. Why are we dealing with Saddam Hussein to begin with? Even if he had some weapons left over, it wouldn't have justified a preemptive invasion of his country. That's the lesson here. Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to learn from its pattern of mistakes?
I don't know. I think we're moving into a new era where the greatest dangers will be calculations involving other great powers. We're moving backwards into an era of great power competition. And part of the problem, part of the pattern of hubris that was exhibited in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11 was a function of the mismatch between American conventional military power and the adversaries that we had identified. Now, of course, even in the case of the axis of evil, so-called, Iraq was the only one of those three who we could so easily defeat if we chose to do so. So I don't think that was a coincidence that they ended up in the crosshairs while North Korea and Iran did not. In any event, managing conflict with Russia and China, direct conflict with them, for example, in a Taiwan scenario, or if Russia were to attack Lithuania or another NATO ally, triggering the United States to rush to its defense, I hope that our system will have learned that these kinds of escalations are extremely difficult to manage. I mean, you look at Joe Biden's policies around Ukraine, and whether you think we should be supplying weapons to the Ukrainians to defend themselves or not, here's a president who has emphasized at every crossroads that I can see, I don't want to escalate. I don't want to escalate. So there is a possibility that as we go back to pure competition in military and other fields, that we will be less arrogant and less blind to the risks that we're trying to manage.
Well, it's one thing to get involved in a war with a nuclear-powered Russia. I'm concerned as well with bullying smaller countries. We've been told for a long time that the biggest problems the world faced were groups like Al-Qaeda or tin pot dictators like Saddam Hussein. Seems to me the post-9/11 era demonstrates that superpowers were the biggest problem in the world. Just look at the devastation and destruction wrought by the war on terrorism. Do you agree with me there?
Well, I think it's hard to generalize about that, but there's no question that the record of American militarism after 9/11 is one of enormous costs and destruction, both abroad and at home. The thousands of lives lost, but many more thousands of lives where people suffered life-changing injuries and came home angry and disillusioned about their colonels and their generals and their presidents, changed our country. We ask, why are we so divided? Why are we so at war with ourselves? And I think these wars are part of the answer. People are angry for a reason. Their elites failed them, and they want a better government. So I think, there's a whole series of cascades from the post 9/11 misadventures that go beyond just the conventional counts of dollars expended and lives changed.
As journalists, we're supposed to remain detached, impartial. Yet as a citizen of the United States, there have been many times I felt ashamed of what my country has done post 9/11. Do you feel that way as well?
Yeah, I really try to. I don't feel ashamed. I'm much more clinical in my thinking about these things. I sort of feel like my role is to try to get under the surface of things and to try to describe them accurately and in all of their complexity. And I find it hard to do that work if I come in with a set of emotional convictions about, sort of responsibility or consequences. I can get to that after I've done the work, after I've done the investigation and the writing. I can step back and try to write analytically what I think it all amounts to, and I try not to swallow my words when I write those paragraphs. But that's not the essence of my methodology. And I do find that there's so many people in this world who, for good and credible reasons, want to tell you exactly what to think about everything. And there's something about me, I'm sure it's a character flaw, but I just recoil from that. I don't want to have my own engagement with these subjects defined by my opinions.
There's no need for us to try to sit down at a table. There's no discussion to be had. He's got chemical weapons. He needs to get rid of them, all of them. He's got biological weapons. He needs to destroy all of them. There's no doubt in my mind he wants to have a nuclear weapon, and he's got some capacity. I'm not saying he's got one yet, but he's developing the capacity, as we learned right after Desert Storm. He needs to get rid of it. No discussion, no debate, no negotiation. The burden of proof is on Saddam Hussein.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, we're going to be joined by the Smithsonian's Kate LeMay, an art historian, and we're going to discuss her book about the American cemeteries in France. The politics, the architecture, the art. That's next as we mark D-Day at 80, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.